Deep in the quiet, pine-shadowed woods of Connecticut, far from the smooth highways and commuter towns, stands the dilapidated skeleton of what was once the Grand Hoyt Mansion. Built in the late 1800s by one of the region's most influential families, the estate was meant to symbolize legacy, wealth, and permanence. Instead, time has twisted it into something else entirely, something whispered about by locals, avoided by hikers, and cautiously approached only by the most fearless urban explorers. It is a place that feels heavy with memory, as though the air itself carries the weight of something unspoken. For decades, the mansion decayed in silence. Its gables sagged, its veranda rotted, and its grand windows collapsed inward, letting in the harsh New England winters. Stories circulated in the nearby towns, rumors of strange lights flickering in the dead of night, of voices echoing from empty rooms, of children who dared each other to step inside but refused to cross the threshold. Yet despite all the legends, no one knew the truth about the Hoyt family or what had driven the once proud estate into abandonment. That changed in the early 1980s, when a group of 3 college students, amateur explorers looking for a thrill, decided to enter the house. They had heard the rumors, read local newspaper clippings about the mansion's decline, and convinced themselves that it was simply an old building with a reputation exaggerated by fear. What they found inside would become one of Connecticut's most chilling unsolved mysteries. The day they visited was humid, the kind of thick summer heat that makes the forest feel alive. They pushed through a tangle of overgrown weeds and broken fencing to reach the front entrance, which hung crookedly off its hinges. The moment they stepped inside, the smell of damp wood and decaying wallpaper washed over them. Dust floated in the air like pale ghosts, disturbed by the intrusion. The grand foyer, once undoubtedly magnificent, was now a ruin of collapsed banisters and warped floorboards. Sunlight struggled to filter through boarded windows, casting weak, fractured patterns across the debris. As they climbed to the second floor, one of the explorers, Mark, the most curious of the group, noticed something odd about the layout. The hallway felt too narrow for a mansion of its size, and the wall on the right side bulged slightly, as if something pressed against it from behind. The wallpaper, a faded floral print, curled away from the plaster in large strips. Beneath the peeling paper, Mark spotted a faint outline, a rectangular shape where a door should have been. He called the others over. They pushed, tapped, and finally struck the wall with a loose floorboard. The plaster cracked. With one final blow, the surface caved inward, releasing a breath of cold, stale air from the darkness beyond. A hidden room, sealed not just by construction, but by intention, revealed itself like a secret exhaled after decades. The space inside was shockingly small, barely large enough for a narrow bed and a single rickety chair. It felt more like a prison cell than a spare room. Rusted metal shackles bolted into the wall gleamed faintly in the dim light filtering through the hole they'd made. A mold-eaten mattress slumped in the corner, its stuffing spilling out like the entrails of some decayed creature. Piles of yellowed newspapers were stacked neatly beside it, their headlines dated across several decades of the early 20th century. Someone had been collecting them, reading them, and living in this claustrophobic chamber long after the family had left. The air was so devoid of circulation that it felt oppressive, almost suffocating. There were no windows, no vents, not even a crack in the boards that had sealed the room. Whoever lived there had been completely cut off from the outside world. The explorers fled the mansion, shaken and pale, and reported the discovery to local authorities. Soon after, police arrived with construction workers and forensic investigators. They widened the opening, documented the room, and tried to piece together how such a horrifying space had existed unnoticed for so long. The Hoyt Mansion had been abandoned for decades, but the room suggested a much more disturbing timeline. Someone had lived in the darkness long after the estate's decline. Yet when investigators combed through the Hoyt family archives, seeking evidence of a missing servant, a mentally ill relative, or even a fugitive, nothing appeared. The family kept meticulous records, birth certificates, employment logs, financial ledgers. But there was no mention of anyone who could account for the occupant of that tiny hidden chamber. Not a single person associated with the Hoyt household had been reported missing, and no unexplained disappearances were recorded in the surrounding towns from the era suggested by the newspapers. The room offered no clues other than the items within it. No personal belongings, no diaries, no letters, no remnants of clothing. Whoever had lived there or been kept there had left no trace of identity at all. Even more unsettling was the fact that there was no structural reason for the room to exist. It wasn't listed on the architectural blueprints. It wasn't necessary for the house's design. It had been added later, deliberately concealed behind plaster and wallpaper, sealed so thoroughly it seemed its very existence was meant to be forgotten. Over the years, theories spread like wildfire. Some believed the Hoyts had imprisoned a mentally ill family member to avoid scandal. Others speculated the mansion had been used in secret by someone unrelated to the family, perhaps a criminal or drifter who found the abandoned home and created the hideout themselves. A few whispered darker rumors that the room was used to confine victims and that the evidence had been buried long before the explorers found it. But none of the theories ever produced answers. The police investigation eventually went cold. The room was resealed, its fractured plaster patched over, its outline hidden once more beneath layers of neglect. Today, the Hoyt mansion still stands behind a sagging chain-link fence, its roof caving inward and its foundation sinking into the earth. The woods creep closer each year, slowly reclaiming the structure. Locals swear the house is cursed, that the hidden room isn't the only secret it holds, just the only one to ever be found. They say that on quiet nights, if you stand near the fence and listen closely, you can hear faint tapping from inside the walls, as though someone or something still waits in that dark, suffocating chamber, desperate to be remembered. No one knows who was kept inside. No one knows why the room was built. And as the mansion continues to crumble, taking its secrets with it, the truth drifts further into shadow, swallowed by time just as surely as the forest swallows the estate. The Hoyt mansion watches silently from the woods, as it always has, its final secret sealed away forever, or at least until someone dares to break the wall again. At the far edge of an overgrown field in Norfolk, England, where brambles climb like skeletal fingers over cracked stone, the remains of the Rovehurst estate sit in silent decay. Long ago, during the height of the Victorian era, the manor was the pride of the district, a beacon of elegance with its ornate ironwork, towering chimneys, and grand windows that once reflected candlelight from lavish balls and family gatherings. Now, the estate is little more than a hollowed ruin, cloaked in ivy and shadow, its history swallowed by time and whispered only in local legend. The last occupants of the estate were the reclusive siblings Arthur and Eleanor Rovehurst, heirs to the property after the gradual decline and eventual disappearance of the rest of their once prominent family. Born into wealth, but raised in near-total seclusion, the siblings were known to be eccentric even in a town accustomed to aristocratic oddities. They seldom ventured into the nearby village, preferring the solitude of their sprawling, aging home. Villagers would occasionally catch a glimpse of them walking the estate grounds. Arthur tall and gaunt with a distant gaze, Eleanor pale and poised like a figure carved from marble. But neither sibling ever spoke to anyone outside the estate. Despite their isolation, the Rovehursts were not forgotten. The estate's silhouette loomed over the countryside like a permanent reminder of a bygone age. Children dared each other to run close to the rusted gate, claiming they could hear someone playing piano from inside, though no music had been officially heard there in years. Adults, too, whispered about the pair. How their lights stayed on until impossible hours. How the few tradesmen who delivered supplies claimed the siblings looked ill, thinner each passing season, with ink-smudged fingers and eyes that scanned the world as though searching for something just out of sight. Everything changed in June of 1910. At dawn, dark smoke billowed from behind the estate's cracked shutters. It poured upward in thick, black plumes, staining the morning sky. Alarmed villagers rushed to alert the authorities, though few dared approach the burning manor directly. The ground surrounding it was tangled with thorns, and the house itself had been deemed unstable for years. When firefighters finally broke down the heavy front doors, they found the once opulent foyer littered with charred fragments of wallpaper and collapsed beams. The interior smelled of burnt chemicals and damp stone. The fire had not spread evenly, strange, considering how flammable the old manor was. Instead, it seemed to have been set deliberately in specific regions of the house, each blaze carefully placed. The dining hall was one of the few rooms largely untouched by fire. There, at a long mahogany table, sat Arthur and Eleanor. They appeared unervingly calm, almost posed, their chairs pulled neatly into place. Their hands were folded in front of them. Their faces were serene, eyes closed as if in quiet prayer. At first glance, the responding officers assumed a suicide by poisoning. The untouched teacups and the faint almond-like smell in the air supported that theory. But the rest of the house hinted at something far more disturbing. The investigation shifted to the cellar, partially protected from the fire by its stone construction. Down a set of narrow steps slick with soot, officers discovered shelves lined with glass jars, each containing preserved animal organs floating in murky liquid. Some had clearly been there for years. Others looked disturbingly fresh. Beside the jars were stacks of journals, their pages filled with dense handwriting and ink-blotted diagrams. The illustrations were crude but detailed. Circles, symbols, anatomical sketches, ritual layouts. The siblings had documented everything meticulously, as though they had been preparing for something long in the making. The investigators struggled to interpret much of the content, but one theme was unmistakable. Death was not an ending in their minds, but a transition, a final journal, its pages only slightly burnt, lay open on a table. The last entry, written in Eleanor's shaky but elegant script, read, "Death is only a doorway. Together, we shall cross it. The body will fail, but the thread remains unbroken. On the higher plane, we will not be bound by flesh nor by time." Investigators concluded the siblings had orchestrated a mutual suicide, fueled by an obsessive belief in crossing into some alternate realm. The fire was intentional, meant to erase their research, their experiments, and any trace of what they had attempted. But the fire did not destroy everything. A portion of the cellar survived, and with it, the strangest part of the entire case. Witnesses reported that even after the flames had been extinguished, a faint whispering seemed to linger in the basement air. At first, investigators dismissed it as airflow through the damaged structure. But those familiar with the estate's layout knew the basement had no natural ventilation, and certainly no way for the wind to carry coherent sounds. The whispers persisted for several days before fading. The Rovehursts were buried quietly, without ceremony. No surviving relatives came forward. The estate was left to rot, consumed by moss and creeping vines, eventually deemed too unstable for renovation or demolition. It still stands, a fractured monument to the siblings and their impossible pursuit. Over the last century, the Rovehurst estate has become a destination for paranormal enthusiasts and urban explorers. Few reach the cellar, but those who do often report the same unsettling phenomenon. A faint sound, like someone reading aloud from a brittle page. Some claim they hear two voices, others only one, but almost all describe the tone the same way: soft, rhythmic, ritualistic. One explorer, a seasoned investigator of abandoned places, described it as follows. It wasn't random noise. It felt purposeful, like a chant or an incantation. I felt watched the whole time, as though something expected me to respond. Another reported seeing pages of old journals flutter despite the air being still. Most people dismiss these stories as superstition, the work of nerves and overactive imaginations in a dark, forgotten place. But those who have studied the journals say the siblings believed wholeheartedly that consciousness could continue beyond the body, that a ritual performed correctly could open a passage, a doorway, as they called it, through which two souls could travel together. Whether they succeeded in their final attempt or doomed themselves to linger forever in the ruin they once called home remains a question only the crumbling walls and decaying journals can answer. To this day, the Rovehurst estate sits quietly at the edge of the field, its broken windows staring blankly into the countryside. But those brave enough to approach at night swear the air vibrates with the faint, delicate sound of pages turning, as if Arthur and Eleanor are still there, reading and waiting for someone to join them on the other side of their imagined doorway. Their legacy is not the grandeur of the estate, nor the wealth of their lineage, but the haunting echo of a belief that refused to die, even after they did. The Klein house once stood proudly at the edge of a sprawling Louisiana plantation, its white columns gleaming under the southern sun. Built in 1894 at the height of the region's agricultural prosperity, it was a symbol of wealth and ambition, a grand home meant to anchor the Klein family's legacy for generations. Its design was imposing yet elegant, 2 stories tall, with a sweeping staircase, wraparound porch, and a roof pitched so sharply it cut against the sky like the blade of scythe. For decades, it served as a landmark for travelers crossing the parish, a place locals spoke of with admiration. But by the time the 1920s arrived, the estate had grown quiet. The once bustling grounds were overrun with weeds, and the laughter that had once echoed in its halls had faded. The home's final caretaker, Marjorie Klein, was a widow known for her private nature. She lived there with her young son, Christopher, after her husband's sudden death a few years earlier. Neighbors recalled Marjorie as polite but distant, a woman who carried a heaviness in her expression, as though the air itself pressed down on her. In June 1923, Marjorie vanished without a trace. She left behind all her belongings, including family heirlooms, clothing, even her wedding ring resting atop her bedroom vanity. The disappearance dominated regional newspapers for months. Some speculated she had fled to escape financial ruin. Others believed she had fallen victim to foul play. A few whispered that grief had driven her to madness. No matter the theory, the conclusion was always the same. Marjorie was gone, and no one knew where. Police searched the property, combing through every room, scouring the surrounding woods, questioning every person who had seen her in the days before she vanished. But nothing, no note, no body, no sighting, ever emerged. Eventually, the investigation was abandoned, and the Klein house entered a long period of decay. Rain leaked through holes in the roof, warping the floorboards. Vines crawled through broken window panes like searching fingers. Teens occasionally dared one another to explore the rotting home, but even the bravest admitted the place felt wrong, like someone unseen was still living inside. For decades, the house loomed over the property like a ghost of its former self, holding tightly to whatever secrets remained within its walls. It wasn't until 2007, more than 80 years after Marjorie's disappearance, that the truth began to surface. A development company purchased the land with plans to build modern housing. As part of the project, the Klein house was scheduled for demolition. Construction workers arrived one humid morning in July and began stripping the interior, pulling down rotted boards and clearing debris. The house surrendered its decay layer by layer until the workers reached the attic. At first, the attic seemed unremarkable, dusty, dim, filled with collapsed furniture and long-dead insects. But one of the workers noticed something odd about the far wall. The boards didn't match the others. They were newer, decades newer, nailed in a hasty but deliberate pattern. When he tapped the wood, the hollow echo suggested the wall concealed more than insulation. Within minutes, the crew pried away the boards. Behind them sat a small, hidden compartment, barely large enough for a child to lie down. The air that escaped was stale and cold, as though the space had not been touched in nearly a century. Inside, illuminated by the thin beam of a flashlight, were unsettling remnants of a life that should never have been secret. There were children's toys, a wooden train missing its wheels, a rag doll whose button eyes had cracked with age, and a tin soldier propped upright against the wall. In the corner sat a tiny rocking chair, its paint chipped and peeling. Beside it lay a narrow cot, the blanket so brittle it crumbled at the slightest touch. But the most chilling discovery was the stack of charcoal drawings resting against the far wall. Each sheet was fragile with age, yet the imagery was disturbingly clear. A woman, shadowy, gaunt, unmistakably resembling Marjorie, was depicted towering over a small child. The child's eyes were hollow circles, empty and haunting. In some drawings, the child appeared to be reaching for help. In others, the woman's hands were outstretched as if to pull him back into the darkness. The crew halted demolition immediately and contacted the police. When forensic teams arrived, they examined the attic compartment with meticulous care. What they found confirmed the worst fears imaginable. Along the wooden walls were faint scratch marks, tiny grooves worn into the surface by small hands. Some marks were clustered near the floor, others near the hidden door. It was clear that someone, some small child, had tried desperately to escape. Then came the discovery that shattered any lingering doubt. Bone fragments scattered in the dust beneath the cot. After testing, they were determined to belong to a child between 5 and 7 years old. Local historians quickly connected this finding to a detail long forgotten in the original investigation. Marjorie Klein had once had a son, Christopher, who had reportedly grown ill and died shortly before her disappearance. But no death certificate had ever been filed, no obituary published, no grave marked with his name. At the time, authorities accepted Marjorie's explanation, believing the boy had succumbed to a fever. No one questioned why she had not held a funeral or notified relatives. They did not scrutinize her refusal to allow anyone to visit the house during the child's final days. They did not dig deeper, and so the truth had remained buried, literally, above their heads for nearly a century. The Klein house was demolished soon after the attic discovery. There was no ceremony, no preservation effort. The community wanted the structure gone. Yet, as the house fell, many felt an unsettling sense that the story was not over. The official case remains unsolved. Without Marjorie's body, authorities could not close the investigation. They could only speculate. Some believe Marjorie, consumed by guilt, fled the property and met a tragic end elsewhere. Others suggest she took her own life in remorse. A few whisper that she never left the house at all, that the woods surrounding the property hold her unmarked grave. But the most chilling theory is the one that refuses to fade. That Christopher was never alone in that attic. Demolition workers and investigators reported hearing soft creaks and faint tapping sounds, even after the boards were torn away, noises that seemed too deliberate to be settling wood. One worker swore he heard the quiet rhythm of a rocking chair, though the chair lay motionless when he turned. Whether these are tricks of memory or echoes of a deeper tragedy, no one can say. What remains is the unsettling legacy of the Klein house, a place that hid its darkest truth in the smallest of spaces, a secret quiet enough to sleep for 84 years, until one day, at last, it was forced into the light.